Welcome to Actual Spinster. My name is Anna Marie, and today I'm going to talk about the books that I'm currently reading for my PhD. Yeah, I'm not doing a lot of actually finishing books or fiction reading at the moment because I have my first chapter draft due on the 10th of July. So depending on when this comes out, it will be ever sooner. But yeah, and so I kind of wanted to chat, I guess, still, and so I thought, I'd show you the bits and bobs I'm reading and kind of talk about them, and hopefully it will be interesting. I also would say that part of what I'm reading, sometimes I read things that are as a way to kind of think about the methodology that I am using or might use, or how I might conceptualize the particular frameworks I'm using, or even just articulate them, even if the subject matter of whatever it is that I'm reading isn't super directly related to what I am actually writing about. So there's some reading like that going on. I just like to read stuff, I guess, so I also just kind of do a bit of that too. I definitely don't plan on finishing all of these books, no way. I'm just going to read them in the best way that in the way that works for me and my purpose right now. I mean, sometimes I wish I could read all of them, and there's maybe one book that I kind of might still do that. Yeah, there's no point, whatever people say, work smarter, not harder, or whatever. It'd be foolish to read all of these books when I definitely don't need to do that in order to either get a grounding in what they're saying, or specifically saying about because not all of the book is relevant to me and what I'm working on. Anyway, that was a long preamble. Okay, well, we'll start with this because I have talked about it recently. This is the CARE Manifesto, The Politics of Interdependence by the CARE Collective, which I believe is just a bunch of academics. It's fine. I thought this would maybe be more helpful than it is, and it's also exceptionally statist. But yeah, I just thought it would be useful in terms of some of the political frameworks, or the political ideas that I am writing on. I guess I'm not really sure if I want to tell you exactly what I'm writing about. I don't know. My first chapter is, my work looks at socialist women's writing at the turn of the century, so my first chapter is obviously about that because it's within the framework, and specifically I'm looking at periodicals. I'm looking at the women's column in socialist periodicals. That's sort of the primary texts that are the basis of my first chapter. Okay, another thing that's not really that useful, but I just kind of started to be interested in, I was thinking about narrative, and also narrative in terms of kind of Marxist literary criticism, narrative as in or gaps in narrative as a way where ideology peeks through or doesn't. And so I just started to read Victorian narrative painting because I was thinking about form a bit, and thinking about kind of yeah, I don't know, and then I was well, maybe this will be useful. It's fine. But yeah, there's a whole range of paintings in it, I believe mostly from the I want to say 1860s, but I don't think that's actually true. Henry James is here because he's always here, and I'm kind of thinking that I have to read him. This is gonna be such a mess of a video, I'm so sorry. But yeah, it starts with a quote from him that he wrote in 1877 criticizing the turn to kind of narrative painting, or reading paintings, I suppose, in 1877. So I think it's from the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 1880s. And we have one of the other books physically present. This book I've definitely shown before. This is Socialist Women Britain, 1880s to 1920s by June Hannam and Karen Hunt. So this book is a really wonderful book. It's a kind of a landmark book in terms of how it engages with socialist women, their sort of politicization, and it also, it problematizes the concept, grouping together of a group of socialist women in this way, because there's lots of differences, but there is also through lines between a lot of them. There's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of organizational overlap and collaboration, and so they're all influencing each other. It looks at specific things in terms of how socialists different, but then also kind of how maybe there is a sort of cohesive socialist women's perspective on things, a gendered socialist perspective, overtly, I suppose, as opposed to implicitly, which obviously socialism often can be, even if it sort of purports to be the objective socialism, but really it's sort of a masculinist, male worker focused one. But anyway, it looks at how socialist women thought about the suffrage, how they thought about the politics of consumption and also internationalism, and it also looks at a bunch of other things in terms of like specifically going into like, you know, specific socialist women in depth and thinking about their lives, and then yeah, how through their politicization, like I said, or through their experiences of socialism, they participated or not within socialist organizing, socialist politics. Was that in any way a good summary? The viewpoint of these women brings a new perspective to both socialist and feminist politics, which will make this book absorbing reading for anyone interested in gender history or the politics of this period. No, it's a really fantastic book. This is an example of a book that I'll definitely read all the way through, even if I'm going very slowly, and like I am still kind of reading the bits that are like the most pertinent to me in the current moment, or that I need, yeah, the most. Okay, so let's keep with the theme of June Hannam and Karen Hunt and talk about Karen Hunt's book. It has quite a long name. Let's see. It's Equivocal Feminists: The Social Democratic Federation and the Women Question, 1884 to 1911. So this is a really great book. I mean, it's important to say, obviously, like I am doing a literary PhD, and these two women, they are historians, like their scholarship is in history. We do use the same or similar source material for this chapter, for, you know, like the women's columns, but like my focus is on the textual formations of socialist feminist politics through them, as opposed to kind of more like the facts of the historical moment. I mean, it's very simplified to think about like what the difference is between like literary and historical scholarship, and I definitely sort of feel like I'm figuring out the parameters myself, or like what it means to be like a literary historian, or like to do literary history and to do like literary work through a historical framework. You know, it's all kind of coming into shape, sort of. It, you know, is interesting to think about, but certainly I do feel like there is a difference of frame, even if, yeah, like sort of the material that we cover is maybe quite similar. I definitely have a commitment to close reading that I love personally, and that is maybe not quite as present in Hunt and Hannam's work. Okay, anyway, but like this book, Equivocal Feminists, so this is, yeah, a case study basically all about a particular organisation of the British left, which was formed in 1884, called the Social Democratic Federation. It did change its name, became the Social Democratic Party, then it became the British Socialist Party, and then I guess maybe that's when 1911 is. I can't quite remember the specifics of the SDF's like formation, but it's quite a famous group, even if it has quite like a negative reputation in terms of, yeah, like sort of people thinking that it's like very dogmatic and just like orthodox Marxist, but like, well, maybe they wouldn't say that, but like dogmatic definitely, and kind of like sterile and like boring, which isn't to say that those things are like totally incorrect or whatever, but I think this is the case, and Karen Hunt definitely makes the case that like or like is part of the sort of historians that are making the case that like the leadership of the SDF is different from the rank and file of the SDF. It had different voices and ideas in it. And of course that's very interesting to me in terms of like looking at a women's column within a socialist newspaper, so a very sort of specific marginal space within like a wider framework, and thinking about like voices speaking in those spaces, as opposed to sort of the outer, wider sort of general masculine political kind of outlook from the rest of the paper. Anyway, but so this book just kind of looks into that, looking at the experience of women in the SDF as much as is possible. There was like a fire, so I believe a lot of the records of the actual like party and organising have been lost, but as best as can be kind of reconstructed, and that's also why like Karen Hunt looks at the women's column in this. I mean, obviously she would anyway, because it's like part of the experience of women SDFers, but like yeah, you know, you have to rely on it maybe a bit more if you're a historian looking for the facts about like committees and stuff, if you can't access the original committee kind of notes or files or whatever. Yeah, great book. Also probably will read all of it, also going very slowly. Okay, we'll talk about a negative one, which is The Making of British Socialism by Mark Boffier. I read a couple chapters of this and I liked the introduction, but then I have been very unimpressed with the rest of it. I might still read all of it, I don't know, it depends if I really feel like it's useful. It's quite introductory, but that sometimes is quite useful to me because I feel like it can be really easy to just get lost in like the many organizations, the many different name changes, the many like briefly important people who then recede. So it can be useful just to read quite like introductory work to get to just to make sure that you have a genuine understanding of the period and of the kind of community and concept of like, yeah, who was on the like late Victorian, early 20th century British left. The reason why this is really deeply unimpressed me is that this book was released in 2011, right? And like for context, this book was released in 2002, or like thereabouts. And like Mark Bouvier, so like let's take his overview of the SDF, right? The formation of the SDF. So he looks at it and he mentions one single woman, and he calls her like Mrs. Hicks, and that's like all we get about her. Like we don't even get like anything else. And like this is like also a time period where like some organizations didn't let women join either as like equal members or at all. I mean, in Austria, like in like 1907 or something, there was like even like, you know, agitating in order to be able to join political organizations because it was like, you know, against the law or whatever to do that. It might not be Austria, I can't remember. There was like a report on it in a paper from 1907 that I read about it. Yeah, so like it just feels very important to me to have like gender and to have like women obviously, but also just gender as a framework like within your historical account of anything, but like, you know, especially something like socialism. And yeah, very frustrating and also kind of like silly because, you know, intensive misogyny was also part of the SDF. Like there's a very sort of infamous, in terms of, yeah, the Victorian British left, guy called Ernest Belthorpe Bax, who was BFFs with William Morris, of course, and who was just this like outspoken misogynistic person. He was like part of the, like, honestly he was like a troll, you know. He was also like part of the like anti-suffrage league with a bunch of like capitalists, you know, like he obviously had no qualms about any you know, anyway, you get it, he sucked. He was so misogynistic that he imagined that the only people who would be arguing with him about the position of women would be men, you know, like that level of misogyny. He did debate with Eleanor Marx in like a letter debate within Justice actually, which is interesting. But anyway, so I lost what I was saying. But yeah, so obviously like misogyny, sexism, the role of women, both it's important in terms of socialism. A lot of the most famous and like popular books about socialism at the time were like The Future of Woman or whatever it's called, you know, the August Bebel classic German one, and like a bunch of other stuff like Woman, Past, Present, Future, that might be what it was called actually. And there was like other stuff too though that, you know, was about women that people really were interested and thought that like one of the major kind of differences would be that women would be different. Obviously the sort of levels of that difference and like what that would include are very people disagreed, people have very different ideas about. But yeah, frustrating and like honestly bad history to just not have any kind of thinking about women. And I mean, I know who Mrs. Hicks was actually, but it's only because of the research I've done that I know about her already from this, you know, chapter. So anyway, Mark Bouvier, not happy with him. I think I'll end with the two that I'm kind of more reading or like read chunks of for this sort of methodology. So this next book I read is Feminist Periodicals and Daily Life, Women and Modernity in British Culture by Barbara Green. I have some of, well, I have chapter 3 printed here. Feminist Spaces and Women's Pages, Rebecca West, and Socialist Periodicals. So yeah, this book is about the everyday and thinking about basically how left women, but it does focus quite a lot on suffragettes, but also on socialist women, and there is a crossover, like there's certainly socialist suffragettes, and then there's also who are like, there are socialist suffragettes who are pro-women's suffrage, which in the eyes of a lot of socialist women, other socialist women, is a form of limited suffrage because it keeps, like it maintains like a class barrier to voting because it doesn't do away with the property bar or disqualification. So but it just says, and women also who are the same class as the men who can currently vote, they can also vote, right? So that's why they called it limited suffrage. So there are socialist women who do believe in women's suffrage, limited suffrage, and there are also socialist women who are adult suffragists. So there's sort of like a Venn diagram, I guess, and then there's also like obviously a lot of suffragists, like women suffragists, limited suffragists who were, you know, pro-imperial, like very weird, a lot of, you know, there's a lot of fascist stuff going on there. This sort of section of the circle, the socialist circle, does include difference, but is also interesting. But basically I would say that Barbara Green's work kind of looks more towards the end, where it's just like towards the like little crossover where it's like women's suffrage and socialist, as opposed to adult suffrage and socialist. But that's not uniformly true, but yeah. So obviously Rebecca West is I mean I'm pretty sure Rebecca West was like a women's suffrage person, but I also might be incorrect with that. She's not my specialty. But yeah, so this looks at the periodicals that like these women created. So I guess it's just looking at like how feminist periodicals at that particular time, like turn of the century basically, I guess maybe more focus into the like 1900s to 1920s, how they used periodical spaces, different formats, women's pages, fashion columns, fiction, that kind of thing, to represent and cultivate a kind of everyday hum of life, and what that kind of maybe means for like the feminist action that they also were part of doing too, and how that kind of maybe reiterated or created a space of like domestic and political life together in sort of harmony or like in tandem. And also thinking about almost like the politicization of daily routines, you know, thinking about where politics comes into play in terms of your daily routine of life, you know, like cooking, cleaning, whatever, like all of, but then how those things are like political, how those things impact your sense of life, gender, whatever. Yeah, that's like a very general explanation, and I'm sorry I didn't think it was very good, but there we go. I think I'll end with my favourite one. So, but this one is Women, Press and Politics During the Irish Revival by Karen Steele. I haven't read very much of this. It's basically about how women were using the like Irish national press, both in similar and different ways to their like male kind of counterparts during the like 1910s. I mean I think it like goes back a little bit, you know, and maybe a bit forward, but like yeah. And so this was also like me thinking more about her methodology than exactly what her argument is, I guess. Obviously that's a part of it, but just thinking about like how she uses periodical texts as a basis for the argument, or the sort of and the narrative that she sculpts out of that in terms of like how women were using the press and how they were like innovating against male ideas and standards of femininity and also political commitment and practice. Very interesting, would definitely recommend. This is a book that I would like to read all of because it's just interesting, but I don't think I will because I just don't have time for that, you know. That leaves us with the final one. That's The Poetry of Chartism, Aesthetics, Politics, History by Mike Sanders. And this book was so good, like I loved the first chapter. And yeah, so this was also read for methodology. He uses like really interesting Marxist literary criticism and kind of looks at how like the conceptualization of aesthetics and politics and what that means for the politics and the aesthetics, and he's obviously looking specifically at poetry, but he's looking at poetry that is printed in the Chartist press. Chartism, I'm not going to go into what Chartism is, maybe just Google it if you don't know what Chartism is, but it's a major kind of working class led movement in the late 1830s, 40s, 50s in Britain, where there was agitating for the enfranchisement of men, basically working class men. There were women Chartists because of the way that the sort of movement played around with, or like both heeded to and also subverted, like militated against sort of particular, you know, Victorian ideas and standards of decorum and responsibility and like blah blah blah. A lot of the women were like told not to speak publicly and to not be part of the, like visibly so part of the movement, so it's like complicated, the legacy of women Chartists. Although honestly one of the things I would love to do is like find them all, like where did they go after the 1850s, these like radical working class women, like where are they? I actually got a book out of the library recently called like After Chartism, so I'm hoping there's maybe some stuff in there about them, I don't know. and yeah, it's called Chartism because they had like a particular charter with a particular set of like things that they wanted, you know. Although what is in the charter and how important the charter is to the actual movement, like that's all sort of part of the academic and whatever debate about them. But yeah, so back to this book. It looks at the poetry published in, I can't remember if it's only one particular periodical, which is Northern Star, or if it's others, but definitely its focus is on Northern Star, which is this Chartist paper, and it thinks about like the ideological work that poetry does, so how it kind of articulates the politics of a movement, and then also the sort of like communicative work that poetry does in that movement, and also the it's a really wonderful like book, 100% recommend. I guess it even speaks to or like thinks about how poetry is or can be a transformative moment within various Chartist lives, and then how through their interaction, their first contact with poetry, how that kind of primed them to be these like subjects, these people who would go on to be Chartists and to be part of a movement. So sort of like as a movement building, practically, ideology building, you know, in terms of like linguistics, language, expression, and then also a third thing which now I've forgotten what I was gonna say. But yeah, so very, very interesting, very interesting, and very interesting for me in terms of like how he looks at like a whole body of work from a particular periodical, you know, the poetry column, and then also very interesting in terms of like how he like thinks about and conceptualizes aesthetics and the political work that aesthetics do, or the sort of potential political dimensions that aesthetics do. He, you know, concludes that like politics and aesthetics were like imbricated, that's the word he used, thoroughly imbricated practices for the Chartist movement, and so yeah, I guess then thinking about form, like aesthetic form, so poetry obviously is an aesthetic form, so then what other aesthetic forms have the capacity to do that or can do that? So yeah, that's sort of what I'm reading. Did that make any sense? Was that interesting at all? I hope so. Let me know if you read any of these books. I'd be really interested to hear, especially the poetry of Chartism. I have a running joke because basically like every supervision, one of my supervisors, she meant like I'm not working on Chartists, like I'm, you know, 40 years later than Chartists, maybe 30, 40 years later. But my supervisor often mentions Chartists, so we have this sort of running joke that, you know, I'm being followed around by a ghost of Chartists. And maybe I'll just give up on my PhD right now and start doing one about Chartists. I'm continuing to leave a link to a GoFundMe in the description box, like which I would really appreciate if you check out and if you can donate to or share. That's everything I wanted to say. Yeah, I hope you're having a good day when you're watching this, and I will talk to you when I next talk to you. Bye!